I just met this morning with a guy who's a big supporter of our work here at Crossroads, whose grandparents were immigrants to this country. He grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts, as a kid without much of anything in his background. And over time, he got himself through school in a really positive way. He had support of neighborhood organizations, and he went on to college and did some great things there. He's built a business and done really well for himself. And he spends his time giving back to communities like ours and sitting with kids like the kids who we work with all the time to say to them, you can be more than your current circumstances might make you believe that you can be. And I think that more people need to be delivering that message to kids all the time.
I completely agree. You know, the most valuable asset one of our youth has is an imagination for the future that does not yet exist. I often think about a simple exercise. Everything that sits around you today, Ned, even the cup that you just drank from, the desk that you're sitting on, the computer that sits in front of you, came out of someone's imagination, right? There was no playbook for these things, but someone created the world around you. And getting our younger generations to believe in a future that does not yet exist is so powerful. And it's an amazing opportunity to have such an impact on the next generation like you do by being so intentional with your time and helping these young individuals to think bigger. All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Hart and Hustle podcast. Today, I'm sitting across this digital table with an amazing leader and CEO of Crossroads Youth Development. Ned Parsons is joining the show. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the mission that is so important in empowering the next generation of great leaders. We're going to talk about the challenges faced by the youth today. We're talking about bridging the opportunity gap, cultivating curiosity and resilience in youth development, and so much more. Ned, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
This is going to be a really exciting story for us to be able to tell today. You know, part of why I thought having you on the show was so important was the pivotal role that you're playing in inspiring the next generation. My father always told me something when I was young. He said, in order for you to achieve it, you first have to believe it. And one of the things I often think about is how pivotal the older or more seasoned generation is in inspiring the next generation beneath them to be able to see and think bigger in the world that they're kind of in. So Ned, I just can't, once again, thank you enough for coming on the show, man. Today's going to be an awesome conversation.
My pleasure. You're speaking my language, so I'm eager to have the conversation. Thanks.
So Ned, let's rewind a little bit and talk about a young version of Ned. Who were you as a youth? Did you have great leaders who inspired you to be the person who sits across the table from us, or what were you like?
That's an interesting question because I think that actually as a youth, while I had plenty of opportunity to observe strong leaders in my life, I don't think that I would have pointed to anyone in particular who was a particularly powerful mentor for me. I was close to my father, but I don't think that I ever saw myself doing the work that he was doing. And so I don't think that I really saw him in that way. I saw him as a support. I saw him as my dad and my guide and the man I loved, but not necessarily the man whose life path I wanted to necessarily emulate. My dad was in sales. I don't think he ever liked it all that much, and so it didn't inspire me to want to necessarily do that. Although I actually did do sales right out of college. It was the first thing I did, but it didn't last that long.
What about your interests? What type of things got you charged up when you were a kid? Because I love hearing the backstory of the man who sits across from me.
Um, well, for sure, as a kid, as a boy, I loved sports. I played every sport I could play at all times, whenever I could be playing them. I ended up sort of specializing as a hockey player. It was a passion of my father's that he and I had in common, so we spent a lot of time with hockey. But I also was raised in a house that believed very strongly in education and the power of education. And my father, for all of his passion about hockey, was always very clear with me that my life was not likely to be in hockey. It was likely to be in something else. And that my schoolwork and other ways of being engaged in the world were as important as my sports and athletics were. Um, I was probably more interested in the sports, but as I grew older, I began to recognize that I loved learning. I really loved school in that way. I'm not saying that I was the world's best student. In fact, I went through some difficult times and periods of my life when I was one of the world's worst students. But I did love learning. I did love being in learning environments, and it's interesting to see for me how as I've grown older, I continue to find ways to learn because I enjoy that as a part of existing in this world.
One of the biggest realizations that I had when it came to my personal development, and my professional success was I was never a good student, Ned. I'm talking, I got C's and D's. I made the honor roll the final semester in high school. And my mom said, "Why did it take so long?" And I said, "At least aren't you glad at least it happened?" But when I went to college and played sports, and then after I got done with that, I had a mentor talk to me and said, "Keenan, you put so much of your energy and time into becoming a professional baseball player. Now that that chapter is gone, you're going to have to apply this competitiveness to something else. So what are you going to turn pro in next?" And I started looking around and I was like, okay, well, I do want to start a business because my father was an entrepreneur. He said, "That's a great idea because guess what? The season of learning and development is for the rest of your life. You're not going to be 34 years old and washed up." How have you taken that competitive greatness that you had when you were playing sports and that hunger into the world of learning as you've kind of developed as a person?
Interesting question. I think that what I've come to recognize is that I get energized and passionate about serving other people and working for the betterment of the experience of other people. And I hope that doesn't sound overly self-righteous, but I just know that when I get into a situation like whether I'm teaching a class of high school kids or coaching a team or running a school as I was doing in my last iteration as a head of school in the independent school world, my competitive drive is always how can I make this experience the best experience in the realm in which it operates for these kids every day that I'm with them. And I obviously can't claim that I always get there, but I do find that I'm competitive in that way, that I don't want to just go in and punch the clock. I always want to go in and find a way to make it better. And I can trace that back to uh, the competitiveness I learned in sports and the competitiveness that still drives me to want to get out and play sports as an adult. So I think that there's a direct relation between those things from when I was a child to as I grew older and joined the workforce.
I'm so interested in our career paths. I had a CEO on the show. Her name was Pamela Sanchez, and she said, often we think our careers are going to be like a ladder, but they're actually like a spiral staircase. And I think I mentioned this in our previous
Hmm.
conversation.
Yeah.
Your experiences as the head of an independent school. Now you're the CEO of an organization that's investing so much time and energy into the next generation. Why did you choose to do this work now instead of exploring and doing something else?
Um, that was a very considered decision on my part. So I was in independent schools for over 30 years as a teacher, coach. I worked in boarding schools for a long time. I was a dorm parent. I moved into administration as a dean of students and then the dean of faculty before I became a head of school. And so over the course of that time, I loved my work in schools. I really loved the kids I got to work with. And my wife and I often look back on that journey that we went through. We raised our children on boarding school campuses. And we think to ourselves how lucky we were to have had the opportunity to live that life and to have built our family in the way in the places where we were able to do that. And then I got to a point a couple of years ago where I realized it was kind of time for something new. And, just to be frank about it, the last several years in school leadership were not easy. They weren't impossible, and we made it through COVID well in the school where I was the head of school, and also a lot of the turmoil that surrounded George Floyd's murder and what came after that. And those were hard times in schools, and the hard times continue to resonate in some ways in schools. But um, for me, it gave me time. It was a time for me to think to myself, what else can I do to serve the world in a larger way than I've been able to do even in the years that I've been working in these schools? So I actually took some time off. I didn't necessarily intend to take a year off, but I did take a year off to think about where I was going, what I wanted to do, my age, and sort of thinking about like how much time do I have left kind of impact the world in a larger way. And at that point, I made the determination that I was ready to step away from my work in schools as much as I loved it and apply what I knew of leadership and what I knew of education to see if I could impact the lives of young people in a broader way in some other context. And so I started looking at nonprofits. I was living in Boston. Boston is rife with nonprofits. So there's a lot of opportunity to serve kids and families in a lot of different ways in Boston. And so I began exploring those opportunities and options. And it took some time. And I feel like I'm incredibly lucky to have found the opportunity that I found because it did give me the chance to bring the skills that I developed as a school leader into an environment that needed those skills specifically: fundraising, strategic planning, campus master planning, uh, program development for bringing kids into the adult world. I could bring all of those skills and my leadership capabilities into an environment that needs it and that impacts, in our case, over 700 kids a year. So all of a sudden, I feel like I'm able to really have a larger impact in a broader way, which is really empowering and energizing for me.
You have a direct impact on the next generation, which is so beautiful to think about. You know, my mom always said something to me every day when I would leave for school. She said, "Keenan, be a leader, not a follower." And it seems like the world that we live in today, social media, everything else, copy and paste trends, a lot of people are more often to be a follower today than to be a leader. Why do you think we have such a shortage of leaders in our communities today, especially at a young level?
I think that part of it is a lack of imagination for understanding what leadership is and what a leader looks like. I think kids will have the tendency to understand leadership in a particular way, and it has a tendency to be pretty stereotypical in terms of what a leader looks like. They will have a tendency to think of, frankly, a male at the front of a room speaking in a loud voice, commanding people and telling them what to do. They sort of think of the general as a leader, right? And while that is a form of leadership, one of the things that I worked with kids on throughout the time my time in schools and that we work with them on here at Crossroads is an understanding of the vast array of leadership skills and approaches that are available to kids as they grow older, and begin to understand that they actually can be leaders in their communities even at a young age, and to develop the skills around how to do that and how to bring themselves into the world in that way is something that we work at every day with the kids that we're in contact with. So I think that for younger kids, they don't really imagine themselves in that leadership role because they imagine that leaders are born and not made. And we have to change that paradigm for them and help them understand that authentic leadership is made and developed over time as we grow and experience more things and understand how to bring our authentic selves into a space and exercise that self in a way that encourages others to follow us. That's leadership. And it doesn't require you to be an extrovert. In fact, I used to always talk to kids about leadership by starting by saying, I'm an introvert, and I have always been an introvert. And yet I find myself in leadership roles and have many times in my life, throughout the course of my life, from a kid, from my childhood all the way through to my adulthood. And I've had to ask myself a lot of questions about how, as an introvert, I continually found myself in those situations. But I think it's because I could imagine making a difference in the rooms that I was in. Um, and I think that the way I was raised enabled me to do that. And I'm not sure everybody feels that empowerment as they grow older.
It's a journey that we go through in becoming a leader. And you mentioned something there, authenticity, which I think is really important. There was a science experiment that was run by these scientists. They brought 40 people into the room, right? And they started asking them to demonstrate different types of behaviors being funny, being, having sorrow, being curious, XYZ. And they were measuring the levels of connection between these two people. Now, you would think that when somebody's funny, right, other people light up, and so you get the biggest sense of connection. But what they found in this experience was actually, or the experiment, was that the people who were being authentic with one another got the biggest readings on how they were measuring the interaction, which I thought was really interesting. But you can obviously tell today when somebody is authentic and shows up as themselves that they have a confidence that is really tough to fake. And I feel like that's a really beautiful form of leadership.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that if you were to present that to most young people, say high school age students, they would recognize it and understand it, though they may not totally have confidence to be able to do it. I think that I've seen it happen over and over again when um, leaders in a high school setting emerge from a crowd of kids who you might not necessarily have immediately penned or pinned as the leader in the group, but that something about the way they bring their authentic selves draws people to them and keeps them there. And I do think kids respond to that really well. They respond to the child who has the confidence to be him or herself in a space full of other kids, unabashedly and unapologetically, and that they'll follow that student as a leader, regardless of whether that person is loud, boisterous, or funny, or any of the things that they might necessarily name as leadership characteristics. They will just find themselves drawn to somebody who's real and who is caring and empathetic and thoughtful and unafraid of being all those things in a setting where, adolescents aren't always comfortable with those kinds of emotions.
Are you ever concerned about the prevalence of the stereotypical image, right, of leadership, masculinity, and everything else that gets put in front of our youth today? Because often, like you said, there are images that are being portrayed on social media of being loud and being brash and being mean and being strict. Like all these things are leadership, but often the opposite couldn't be more true.
Right, and I am worried about it for a variety of reasons. Number one, it precludes girls from the possibility of seeing themselves as leaders in many cases, and that is worrisome to all of us. I think that when we work here at Crossroads with boys and girls, and see all of them as leaders, and teach them all to see themselves in that way. And I think when you have a definition of leadership that by its the parameters that are set for it, um, almost automatically excludes introverts and in many cases girls, um, and those who may see the world in a different way. You really have taken them out of the equation in a way that is both unfair and also limits what that space is going to be able to be, because those kids' voices won't be in the mix. And unfortunately, kids as they grow, they can begin to believe the narrative that they're hearing about themselves from around them. And I think it's really worrisome and hard for me to think about kids who get to a place where they just decide that what they've sort of come to understand about themselves from external sources is their reality, and that's just the way it's going to be. When we know that kids can be empowered, and we want to empower them all the time to make the narrative about their future, to build that bigger vision for what they can be, and to go out into the world and execute on that vision. So, yeah, I do worry about that all the time, and I worry about it too because I think that particular narrative about what leadership is so narrow, and so confining, that I would want to see it eliminated as quickly as possible.
I mean, even the time in which we're recording this, right? It is October 30th, 2024, in a couple days, regardless of your political affiliation, right? We have Kamala Harris, a woman who's standing on the global stage of being the next potential leader of the United States. Do you think about how something as small as that, independent of what you think about, the different political parties, is going to inspire the next generation of girls to think about how they can lead something as powerful as the United States?
Oh, there's no question that that would be momentous in that regard, and in so many other ways too. As a biracial woman who is really extraordinary in her many ways that she is as a leader, and as an effective voice for kind of moving the country forward. I guess I'm putting my politics out there, which I didn't really want to do on this podcast. But um, I think that that's an extraordinary message for girls as they look out at the world to understand that, and I think it's been effective in the way that Kamala Harris has continually told her story from the perspective of herself as a little girl, being raised by her mother and close to her sister, and thinking about how she moved from, middle class girl with a biracial background, living in a relatively urban area, and how she moved herself into the position that she's in right now. One of the things we're trying to do with kids all the time here is to get them to reframe the future that they see for themselves. It's common for kids to understand the future in the context of their present, and we're trying to get them to understand that actually, the story of your future is not limited to the reality of your present right now. You are actually the author of something that's bigger than where you are currently, and that's true for all kids in all situations. But so many kids feel limited by where they are currently sitting, and I would want them to be able to look out at the world and see how many times there are people in front of them who are in leadership roles making a difference in the world who didn't start off in a way that would necessarily predict where they are right now. I just met this morning with a guy who's a big supporter of our work here at Crossroads, whose grandparents were immigrants to this country. He grew up in Fall River, Massachusetts, as a kid without much of anything in his background. And over time, he got himself through school in a really positive way. He had support of neighborhood organizations, and he went on to college and did some great things there. He's built a business and done really well for himself. And he spends his time giving back to communities like ours and sitting with kids like the kids who we work with all the time to say to them, you can be more than your current circumstances might make you believe that you can be. And I think that more people need to be delivering that message to kids all the time.
I completely agree. The most valuable asset one of our youth has is an imagination for the future that does not yet exist. I often think about a simple exercise. Everything that sits around you today, Ned, even the cup that you just drank from, the desk that you're sitting on, the computer that sits in front of you, came out of someone's imagination, right? There was no playbook for these things, but someone created the world around you. And getting our younger generations to believe in a future that does not yet exist is so powerful. And it's an amazing opportunity to have such an impact on the next generation like you do by being so intentional with your time and helping these young individuals to think bigger. But here's a tactical question. When you have someone who comes through your guys' program and doesn't believe that they have a future that's worth pursuing, how do you change that mindset and get them to think about that bigger vision?
Great question, because that's our work, right? In a nutshell, we work with about 700 kids a year from second grade through high school, and then we actually stay with them for a couple of years after they graduate from high school, in a couple of different ways and a couple of different programs. So we have second through eighth graders in overnight summer camps. We have sort of an old-fashioned summer camp where kids learn to swim and ride bikes and or do archery and all sorts of other opportunities to be outdoors as much as possible, playing in the dirt, building forts, working on the high ropes course, climbing walls, all sorts of ways for them to be building confidence and seeing themselves grow from what they are when they arrive to what they can be by the time they leave, just 12 or 24 days later, depending on how many sessions they're with us. We also run a leadership development program for older kids from eighth grade through high school, which is also camp based. They start with us in summer camp programs, but then the challenges that those kids face increasingly grow over time when they're with us. In their first 3 years, they're doing camp-based programming that includes treks where they go out and do camping and long hikes, culminating in their third year with a 9-day hike in the Tetons. where working with the National Outdoor Leadership School, they learn to navigate by compass, make their own meals, sleep under the stars. It's a real challenge for them that they have to overcome and very far out of their comfort zone. The kids we work with are coming out of inner city Boston and Brockton. These are kids who are 70% or over 70% of these kids qualify for free and reduced lunch. 95% of them identify as BIPOC. These are kids who are coming out of neighborhoods that don't have the resources for them to be able to participate typically in extracurricular, after school, and summer programming. And we know that those programs have a major impact in helping kids to develop confidence, strength in their social and emotional skill level, in addition to their ability to connect and be a part of communities that support them as they learn and grow. So, one thing we do in our programming to get to your question is we begin everything we do with all kids we work with a ground based understanding that until kids are in a place where they know they belong, where they know they are known, cared for, respected, and challenged, they can't really do much else. And so the first thing we do with them when they come in is make sure that they understand those things about where they now are. They come into a community that is steeped in the knowledge of how to help them with their social and emotional learning, and how we help them to make friendships. You know, the younger kids we're working like, how do you be a good friend? We work with them in team-based activities. We work with them on problem solving, communication, the kinds of what are sometimes referred to in leadership circles as soft skills, to help them be able to make connection first. Once they're connected and they feel confident that they can really be their authentic selves in an environment that supports them, cares for them, and respects them for that authentic self, now they can start to take risks and try things they've never tried before. Let me give you one quick example. One of the things we focus on here in the camp setting is learning how to swim. Many of our kids coming out of inner city Boston don't know how to swim. Many of the kids who show up here actually show an abject terror of bodies of water, because they've been taught as they grew up to stay away from water because the parents never learned how to swim, and they're terrified of what could happen if their kid gets near water. So we go from there with kids to getting them through the Red Cross swim levels to level 7, and many of them become junior lifeguards by the time they're done with us. And we work them through that program a little bit at a time, building their confidence in the pool in a life jacket, floating in a pool with a lifeguard without a life jacket, eventually getting to a place where they earn what they refer to as their deep end tag, as a band around their wrist that says they're allowed to swim in the deep end. So we're able to say to them, look where you were, look how hard you worked, look where you are now, so that even young kids can see the connection between um, where they began, what they put in, and where they ended up. And they can take that lesson into any challenge for the rest of their lives, understanding that where you are doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be there, down the road. Where you end up is a function of how you approach where you are, how you take in the teaching that you're being given, how hard you work at the skills you're being taught, and how you apply those skills when the challenge shows up. So I think that's what we do with kids in a really, really positive way. And the other thing we do with kids is we exercise patience with them. I watch our counselors on our campsite at times. There'll be one kid, for example, sitting off to the side, and I say to the counselor, "What's going on over here?" Quietly, and the counselor will say, "She's not ready yet, but when she's ready, she'll join." And and I've taken that wisdom from young people who work with these kids all the time, and backed away, and I've watched, and it happens, right? Understanding that not every kid is ready for every challenge immediately in the moment. Lots of times, for example, on our high ropes course, it's all a kid can do to put on the harness, right? And they'll watch every other kid go through the high ropes with the harness on, and they won't go near it on day 1. But by day 12, they're up on the high wire, walking across it in the harness, being cheered on by the kids down below who are screaming at them for the accomplishment that they've just made as they got themselves up on that high rope. It took them 12 days to get there, but by exercising that patience with them and cheering them on when they get there, we demonstrate to them their strength and their ability, and they now can believe in themselves and say, maybe I do have the ability to do things I didn't think I could do when I go out into the world.
Ned, you got me fucking jacked up right now, man. Just like hearing the impact that you're having on this next generation is incredible. And if I had a son or a daughter, I'm definitely sending them through Crossroads so they can learn some of
Okay.
these important lessons, man.
All right,
So
bring them on.
someday in the future, brother. So you said something that was really interesting at the end of one of those values. You said, and challenge them, right? I feel like we live in a world where often we think that nerfing the world of all challenges and all, all types of adversity that we'll face is the right way to build a child. Why is challenging them something that you guys say that you're going to do?
Because the only way for a child to truly believe in themselves is for them to prove themselves to themselves. So you can tell a child all you want that they can be anything they want to be in this world. Um, but they can't believe that if they can't see themselves doing, say, I don't know, surgery, right? You can say to a child when they're young, if you want to be a doctor, you dream it, you go out, you can be a doctor. But if you can't teach that child the science, they're not going to be able to be a doctor, right? So we take these young kids and we say to them, you can do it. But that's not enough. You have to say to these kids, you can do it, and I'm going to show you how. I'm not going to put you in the deep end yet because you're not ready for it, but you will be. So you do your work, I'll do my work, and together we're going to overcome this challenge that's in front of you. You'll see. And I know it can happen because I've seen it happen for so many kids exactly like you. So stay with me. We're going to get you there. Let's go to step one, right? You just break it down, break it down, and break it down for them. And as you break it down and they begin to overcome those challenges a little bit at a time, the more you're able to say to them, okay, good, you got it. Let's go to the next challenge. The more they're going to see that their growth is directly related to how hard they can push themselves. And eventually, as they get older and understand it this way, to how willing they are to take the risk to put themselves. I don't want to say put themselves at risk, but to take a risk and to fail sometimes,
Mhm.
and that they'll begin to recognize that failure isn't death. Failure is learning, and that failure is a way that you begin to understand how to do it right, right? Because once you learn how to do it wrong, you know you just learned something, and you can get up from that and do it again. So it's really important to challenge kids. The other thing that challenging kids does is it demonstrates to them your respect for them. You're saying to them, you're capable. I know you're capable and you can do this thing. You don't have the skill to do it yet because no one's taught you the skill yet, but you can get there. And when they feel that respect from you, it's amazing what kids will do and try when they know that they're in a safe space where they can take that risk and they're going to be supported even if they don't get it right. You know, once they try and fail in front of you, and you're able to say, okay, that didn't work. Tell me what didn't work. Why didn't it work? What do you understand about what needs to be done differently? Great. Now let's try it again. Show me that you can do it. At that point, you got them. They're going to be able to then step into the next challenge and not worry about whether it works right away or not, but think differently about how to break it down and go forward. Challenging kids teaches them that you respect them and teaches them that their limitations, their self imposed limitations, are too narrow, and that they have to keep breaking through those self imposed limitations by trying.
I am deep in my feelings right now because I had an experience of impacting a younger person a couple weeks ago. My sister's stepson, his name is, I'm going to call him Levy on this show. He is 11 years old and he's playing baseball for the first time, first season. He wants to be a catcher, right? And we went through the process of making sure that he knew what to do behind the plate. And what we found was he was scared of the baseball. So we started throwing some little softballs at him and he was like pulling away from it. Now, what we did together was show him that the ball, first of all, didn't hurt. And by the time we were done, instead of throwing little softballs into the ground and having him block him, he's literally taking full baseballs off the chest. And seeing how excited he was because he pushed beyond that limiting belief made me smile for days. And literally, I still get chills when I think about it. You have to feel so jacked up, Ned, just seeing the impact that you're having on this next generation day by day. I mean, I'm imagining that it's incredibly addicting to do the work that you do.
There's no question about it. When we run camp during the summer here, my my role here as president and CEO is not to run camp on a daily basis. But I'm out there on camp every day in some way, shape, or form. So I can see and watch and get to know some kids and really get to know the counselors well too. I really love learning their work with these young people who are working with the youngest kids that we're working with. We've got kids from all over the world here working with these kids. But it is addicting to see this happen. I'll tell you a really quick story of my first day here. I only started this job 6 months ago, so I'm still learning myself. But I've worked with kids for a long, long time, right? 35 years working with children. I know education, but I don't know the camp world as well. So my first day here, I walked out on camp, and part of our thing, our focus here is getting kids into the natural world. These are kids who are growing up in urban environments. We really want them to experience the pond and the pools and the trees and the hills around us and whatnot. And so as I walk out towards where some kids are engaged in an activity, I notice one boy in our youngest group. He's a second grader, and I can see he's off by himself, and he's digging in the dirt off to the side. So I walk over to him, and I say, "Hi, what are we doing?" And he looks up at me with his bright eyes, and he says to me, "I'm looking at nature." And I thought, okay, okay, show me what you're looking at. And he pointed to a holly bush, and he said, "That's a scary plant. It's really sharp." And I said, "Yeah, holly is sharp." We started talking about it a little bit, and then he right away was showing me something else. And then there's a bug over here. Look at the bug. Look at the bug. He was out of his mind, excited about the natural world that he was discovering on his own. And I thought to myself, okay, we're doing something here. Like, this kid is opening up in a way that he doesn't even understand at this point. He's in second grade, right? And right at that moment, he got called by his counselor to come over to the group because they were heading off to their next activity. And so he just turned and started to run off with the group, right? And about 4 steps away from me, he stopped and he turned around and he came back to me and he put his hand on my arm and he grabbed onto my forearm. He looked me right in the eye and he said, "Will you be here when I get back?" And I thought to myself, okay, this is what we're doing, right? The combination of this boy just discovering, and then wanting relationship and wanting to make sure that um, that a male in his life who he just met was going to be here when he returned. It was so arresting for me. That was the time when I realized, okay, we're doing something here. We're doing something real here. And I got to tell you, I said to him, "Absolutely, I'll be right here when you get back." He turned around and ran off with his group. I didn't see him for the rest of the day. And when I ran into him at dinner, I went over to him and said, "Hey, how was the rest of your day?" And he looked at me like, "Who are you?" Because he's in second grade and he had no idea who he was talking to in that moment. But over time, I developed a relationship with that little boy, and I watched him grow. And it turned out he had certain challenges that he was facing down, and he grew in exponential ways right in front of us, and it was great to see.
I had an amazing CEO, a younger guy named Kevin Irvin, who was on the podcast. He grew up in the Bronx, and he was incredibly gifted. Went to an amazing charter school, became a musician. He now keyboards with Imagine Dragons, and it travels the nation. Right. One thing he said was, if I could have something on my tombstone, it would say "Born in Brooklyn, raised at camp," because he went to a camp very similar to Crossroads and experienced life for the first time. Do you really think about the experience of being out in nature and seeing that second grader looking at nature with wide eyes and so much excitement as maybe the antidote to a lot of the mental health challenges that the youth are facing today by spending so much time, Ned, on these devices?
Yep. I see it absolutely. I don't know if you've ever come across the book Last Child in the Woods.
Mm-mm.
The author's last name is Louv, Louv. It's a book I read maybe 10 or 12 years ago that really changed a lot of my thinking about this issue and how I think about the impact of the natural world. It really forced me to think about the role of the natural world in my own life. I grew up in a suburban environment, but as I look back at my life, I realized that um, we were outside all the time, and I was always climbing trees and digging in the dirt and playing at the lake and riding my bike, and just it was a constant need to be outdoors. And as I got older as an adult, I am very closely tied to being outside in the natural world. And so the hypothesis in this book is something the author refers to as nature deficit disorder. And what he says is that at that time, this was before the current mental health crisis for adolescents was sort of made known to us all. This is maybe 2010 or so, 2009. But at that time, he was saying, that it's his hypothesis that the actual physical separation that kids experience from the natural world, literally, the not playing in the mud, building mud pies and climbing trees and building forts, has created in the souls of children a void that they're struggling to figure out how to fill. And I came to believe that this is really true. And there's a lot of work out there that's been done on the power of the restorative power of being in the natural world, and how many kids who are struggling with mental health disorders and mental health challenges get out into the natural world, and they find that a lot of their challenges are dissipated, particularly anxiety and depression. And I can tell you that my a lot of my staff here at the camp are teachers in the public schools here in the Boston area, and they know a lot of our kids at during the school year. And they'll tell me that there are some kids here at our camp during the summertime who present in school settings with IEPs and medications for a series of things that they're struggling with, and who present in ways that need to be managed while they're in school, in active ways by school personnel. They come to camp, and none of these things are apparent to any of us in the course of their time here. Um, in particular, we had one young boy in one of our youngest groups who was on the autism spectrum in school and was nonverbal in school, who's absolutely verbal in his time at camp here.
Wow.
And although I could see signs from time to time of behaviors that I think I'm not a qualified clinician to be able to say this in a clinical way, but he certainly exhibited behaviors at times that could easily appear to be on the autism spectrum, but they were mostly things like separating himself from the group at times to kind of catch his breath and gather himself. But overall, this is a boy who is singing and dancing with the group and standing on his chair at lunch and dancing to music that's playing in the background. Um, Friends with kids in his cabin, very much connected. And the people who know him from school are looking at me with wide-eyed saying, "You can't understand how different this is from what we see in the school setting every day with this very same child." So I'm very much a believer that the natural world and human connection in spaces where you get to be who you are without any kind of constraints on you are the antidotes to the feelings that a lot of kids are struggling with right now.
Yeah, man. We live in a world where we're being fed a narrative where hyper connection through digital devices is the answer to all this isolation and loneliness that we're feeling. Yet we continue to take more bites of that poison apple that leave us feeling more alone. I had an amazing leader on the podcast before who is the president of the Massachusetts Applied Behavioral Analysis Board. So helping with children that have disabilities like autism, ADHD, and things like that. He said, it's really interesting to me that we are diagnosing children with attention deficit disorders consistently. But yet when you put them in a different setting that's outside of the classroom that is four white walls, these kids are more engaged and more attentive than ever. So do we have a disability, or do we just have an engagement and an interest problem?
Mm.
I thought that was really interesting to me, but you just kind of hit it on it as well.
Yeah, I think that that's something that educators have been struggling with for a long time, and it's true that um, in the world of education, the prevalence of ADHD and diagnoses and medications for those things has really skyrocketed in recent years. And, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I think people are really wrestling with where this is coming from, whether we just didn't know what it was before and didn't diagnose it, or whether we are too quick to think about ways of sort of diagnosing those things without looking for other ways of approaching what's happening for kids in schools.
I had the privilege of interviewing a neuroscience, or I'm sorry, a brain surgeon with a PhD in neuroscience, and I asked him one question. I said, "What is the most important skill set an individual can develop across their lifetime?" And he said, "Emotional regulation." And we got down this tangent because there's a really good book out there, and the name of the author escapes me, but it's called Indistractable. And what he talks about in this entire book is how he's worked with companies like Facebook and Instagram and all these other people to help create those platforms for as much engagement as possible. And he said, one of the things I didn't recognize that I start to observe now is whenever somebody is in an uncomfortable situation, specifically mid to level aged adults and children, whenever they find themselves in a feeling of being uncomfortable or a little awkward or a little anxious, the behavior that we've anchored in our brain is pulling out our device, Ned. Everybody escapes to their device. And if you've anchored this behavior over hundreds of thousands or millions of times of your lifetime, it's really easy to understand how we don't have emotional regulation, because every time we feel one of those flare-ups inside of us, we run away to being alone together in this device and in this digital world that doesn't exist. It's really interesting to me.
Well, one of the things that we do here is we remove that device temptation from kids. So on camp, there are no phones and there are no electronic devices,
I
and
love this.
we just push the kids to be outside and to be together, to sit around the campfire, to play team-oriented sports, to um, ride bikes and learn how to swim, and all these things that are so much more enriching in many ways. And for a lot of our kids, as they get older, will really miss their devices, and you can see what happens the minute we hand them back to them as they get on the bus to go home. They all go silent. The bus ride home is silent, right? Because all of a sudden they're catching up. They're back on their
Yeah.
devices. Um, but um, but I love it. When I was working in my last school, we took devices away, not devices, sorry, we took phones away from all of our middle school kids every day. And they would come to a place by the end of their middle school years where they would thank us for that. And they would
100%.
talk about how much better their days were not being on the phone all day long.
There's a major university, one of which is equivalent to the Ivy League here in the United States, over in the UK, where members of parliament and royal family members go to. And I was listening to this podcast the other day, and the headmaster was talking about one of the things that he does that other universities would never even consider. He said, as soon as these students, I don't care how affluent, how well connected or resourced your family is, when you get on campus here as a freshman, we take out your SIM card of your smartphone and we put it into a flip phone that doesn't have access to the internet and doesn't have access to social media. Why? Because we realize the magic in this experience of higher education here is you actually being present enough to start ideas and have conversations with your classmates.
Hmm.
Now, parents threw a fit when he first started doing this, but the
I'm
results
sure.
on the other side of it have been insane because people are more attentive, they're more focused, they're less distracted, and they're coming up with beautiful, great ideas that they're implementing in the real world that affect everybody when they're not dealing with the element of distraction, man.
Right. Right.
So cool.
Well, I wish all the universities luck in making that happen.
Maybe after your tenure at Crossroads, we can have you be the head of education in the United States and change our country, man, which would be absolutely amazing,
Yeah,
Ned.
we'll see.
So, one of the traditions we have here on the podcast, Ned, as we kind of put the wheels down, is our previous guest wants to ask you a blind question.
Okay.
Now, when it comes to leading, when it's most difficult, what conversation do you have to help yourself stay steadfast like the leader you want to be?
That's a great question. And it calls to mind the many times when crisis arrives, which it always does, or what I should say, which it never does at a convenient time. And the instinct as leader is to want to react immediately to it. I think the conversation, if I understand the question right, the conversation I have is comes from a mentor of mine who I worked with when I was a dean of students, who used to always stop the conversation to say, what problem are we trying to solve? Because more often than not, um, the surrounding buzz around a thing that shows up on your desk one day is louder than the thing at the center of it itself. And it's easy to react to what's loudest when sometimes what is in the middle of it is what you need to actually be trying to solve for. And that has been a learning curve for me. I literally would watch him do this and be amazed at how well he could parse out what the actual issue was that we were talking about. When I was younger at this work as a dean of students, there's just so much noise around it. I was reacting too much to the noise. So the conversation I have in my head is, what are you trying to solve? And how do you best impact the situation for everybody involved by solving the right problem?
A beautiful place for us to put a bow on this episode, Ned. I just can't thank you enough, man, for being the true representation of Heart and Hustle. And I can't thank you enough for everybody who's tuning in, watching, and listening today for coming on the show. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I wish you the best.
And that's a wrap, guys. We'll catch you in the next one.